Hello, everybody, and welcome to this conversation about the past, present, and future of agriculture in Northeast Minnesota. My name is Federica Ranelli. I work with the Finland Food Chain Project as the Community Education and Outreach Coordinator. I'm really excited to be moderating this discussion today. So I'll be introducing our panelists and then helping to field your questions. And without further ado, we've got David Abazs and Randy Hanson here to talk with us today. Randy Hanson, PhD, is the co-director of the Eco-Entrepreneurship Program and the LSC Living Lab at Lake Superior College. He grew up on a farm in western Minnesota, and he has long worked in developing place-based food systems at a regional scale, founding the UMD Land Lab and other platforms for experimenting with sustainable community development. And David Abazs. He's a well-known figure in the Northeast Minnesota region and a longtime partner and former board member of the Northeast Regional Sustainable Development Partnership. He's a former University of Minnesota endowed chair in agricultural systems through the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture. As an endowed chair, Abazs partnered with farmers and University of Minnesota faculty to research food shed modeling efforts and food systems capacity in Northeast Minnesota. So welcome, Randy and David, and let's get started.
Welcome. This is Randy Hanson. I'm honored to be part of this webinar. Thank you, Finland Food Chain, for devising and facilitating this, especially to Frederica and Corey and others who helped out. So David and I will be kind of sharing the presentation here, and I'm going to begin with a brief sort of discussion of some of the key historical elements of the Duluth and regional food system as it took shape sort of after the 1880s. And of course, there was a large food system since time immemorial in this region by tribal communities. And that is something that is in resurgence and something from which we have much to learn and emulate relative to regeneration and sustainability. What I'm going to focus on is sort of the crisis that that was brought about by European colonization and subsequent attempts to build a food system that would feed the growing numbers of peoples that arrived in the region after the 1870s and 1880s. So as you may know, this region, Northeast Minnesota, has experienced, beginning in about the 1880s and 1890s, phenomenal rates of growth, primarily due to the new forms of extraction that were taking place. And Northeast Minnesota has long been a site of extraction for building the wealth of regions outside of our area here. Early on in the 1600s and going forward with the fur industry, the timber industry beginning in the 1870s, but especially in the 1880s when it was burnt out in Michigan and other areas, and the timber companies jumped to this region. At around a similar time, the beginnings of the iron ore industry in the 1880s and 90s, and then the taconite industry in the 1940s and 50s, and perhaps sulfide mining and other issues that are being proposed and fought over today. But the point that I'm making is that this site has long been an area of extraction. And in 1880, 1890, there was a huge upswing in populations of Euro-Americans who came here to help extract resources, namely timber and iron ore. And Duluth was the hub of that in many ways, given that it sat at the point of Lake Superior and had, channeled a lot of the the wealth and resources to areas beyond, and it was booming in the early 1900s. And, you know, it's often said that Duluth had more millionaires per capita than any other place in the country. I'm not sure how true that is exactly, but there was a lot of huge wealth here relative to the population, given both the extraction and the real estate flipping that was going on here. And the precursor to the Chamber of Commerce at that time was known as the Duluth Commercial Club. And this was where sort of the wealthier businessmen got together to share their experiences and talk about things and so forth. And one of the big issues for them at that time in the early 1900s was food, namely the cost and quality of food. We had such a huge recent population that had arrived here, Euro-American population, without an agricultural base. And as a result, people who worked here in the mines in the timber industry often had to use 60–70% of their income for food, and it was often very poor quality. And so it became a powerful organizing tool in the labor movement. And these sort of captains of industry at that time realized that this was a problem for them and wanted to sort of commit to undermining this issue as an organizing platform. And so they sort of began to have conversations and work together to think about how do we build a local food system that can supply more of the food needs of the population that is growing here. And one of the sort of people that was a key figure in this was Charles Craig, who was a real estate developer, founder of Jean Duluth Farm, and all around entrepreneur. And he worked with the wealthy people of Duluth to develop a plan which focused initially on hiring A.B. Hostetter, who was a farmer and agricultural teacher in Indiana. And they brought Hostetter in because he had worked extensively in Indiana and other places to sort of think at a regional scale, how do you design systems that include, you know, production and processing and distribution and access together in sort of newly forming areas, and how do you work with stakeholders, business, government, nonprofits, to achieve that goal? And they set out initially and put this plan in motion, in which they began to purchase the cut over lands in our region, you know, that the timber companies had clear cut by, say, 1910, 1912. Most of the area around Duluth and the region had been extensively clear cut, and the timber companies wanted to get rid of this land as soon as possible. But of course, it had problems in that we had these giant white pine stumps and so forth. So one of the things that the Duluth Commercial Club did was launch this Gray Salon Farm Company to facilitate the establishment of homesteads in the region. And, you know, the clearing of these giant white pine stumps was a very significant task, often needing dynamite and so forth to explode these giant stumps to sort of, you know, speed up the process. At any rate, the Gray Salon Farm Company ended up purchasing large amounts of land and had different sized plots, typically 5, 10, and 15-acre plots that had market garden systems built into them. And you could buy a plot that had the house and all of the stumps removed, or you could buy one that had the house with no stumps removed and so forth. but it facilitated this market garden production system in our region that was designed, again, to bring fresh produce into our area. The commercial club also worked with railroad companies at the time, the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range Railroad, that had been granted rights of ways to build these lines to the Iron Range and connect the extraction points with the distribution sites on Lake Superior. And they worked with the railroad companies to help them fund small towns and small farms along the railroad, again, in order to facilitate food production in our region. They gave out seeds, they brought education to people who were interested in moving to these areas, and also designed railroad stops to move product and produce into the areas of population. They worked with nonprofits such as the YMCA to design gardening classes and poultry raising classes that were both urban and rural oriented, again, to facilitate production that would both be for self-procuring, but also to move product into farmers markets and grocery stores and restaurants and so forth. They held, contests at the state fair as a way to publicize the land in our region, to draw farmers from broader Minnesota and beyond. And in this site here, you can see that at the state fair, St. Louis County won prizes in 1910 and 11 in potatoes and celery and cauliflower and all of these more cool climate products. And again, this was primarily to publicize the movement of farmers into our region, to show them that indeed there was this land, there was this availability, and there was this success. They collaborated and produced the first garden primer for our region, the Duluth Garden Primer, working with the Home Crofting Committee of the Duluth Commercial Club again, that basically help people understand the soil and what varieties of plants that could be used to increase home gardening in areas. And here's a sort of section or a couple pages from that with Egyptian and crimson globe beets and Denver's carrots and Chantenay and so forth, and then telling you on the left-hand side how to go about amending the kind of clay soil here for production. They worked with the city and other cities in the region to create community garden sites for urban workers and mine workers and so forth. This is a shot from 1910 in West Duluth, a very, very large area for urban people to have community gardens in Duluth to, again, grow food.
Looks like they're doing the social distancing already.
Yeah, well, it was 6-8 years before the Spanish flu pandemic. Here's Hartley Farms, which today, of course, it has all been regrown with trees, but at that time, in the wake of the clear cutting, it was a complete fieldscape. And Hartley produced lettuce, huge amounts of lettuce, and shipped them in refrigerated cars, lettuce to Milwaukee and Minneapolis and other cities around the Midwest, along with raspberries and other crops. The commercial club worked with farmers to create a cooperative marketing association for farmers so that they could get around the middle sector and, again, make themselves viable by claiming a greater share of the food dollar of their sales. And this cooperative marketing association was founded in 1911. And in Duluth, the farmers market was founded in 1912, all again for the purpose of assisting the farmer to keep as much of the food dollar as they can by the most direct marketing possible. And they also were cognizant of the local multiplier effect, so to speak, what we call today, by promoting local products, encouraging people to buy local. And this brochure is from Halloween of 1912, in which a Duluth Home Products Dinner was held in the Duluth Auditorium, where everything served was made or processed in Duluth itself. And, you know, here's a list of names of the people who were helping organize this event, which, you know, these are people's names who are found on county names and building names and so forth and so on today. These were the, you know, the wealthy people of Duluth at the time, who were encouraging local consumption of locally harvested and processed items. And all kinds of items, from, you know, produce to flowers to candy to matches, etc., were being promoted here. And they used songs of the day, pop songs of the day, to promote this event. And this is, they rewrote the lyrics in order to sort of create a jingle that would help people remember to buy locally. And this is a tune to the melody of My Bonnie. So it's, Duluth is the queen of the cities, Duluth is the queen of the West, Duluth is the best place to trade in, just try her and she'll do the rest. Try, dear, to buy here, break off the habit to roam, please try before you die to leave part of your money at home. So again, they are promoting local production and local consumption for the local multiplier effect of Duluth. And finally, they helped encourage and convince the University of Minnesota to site the Northeast Experimental Station, which became the Northeast Agricultural Experimental Station. They bought land from the Gray Salon Farm Company that I had mentioned earlier, 240 acres, to create this teaching, demonstration, and learning farm that was open from 1912 to 1976. They held their first institute in 1914, training farmers on how to grow produce, animals, it's a fruit in our region. It was known as the Northeast Station campus in the 30s, and this was its heyday in the 1950s. And this was part of, again, a commitment on the part of our land grant institution to help build a sustainable agricultural presence in our region for what they called permanence at the time. They recognized that you could not have a permanent land settlement unless you had an agricultural base. But of course, as the global industrial food system took shape in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, it captured the university and changed our food system dramatically, and this station was closed in 1976. In summation, what's really interesting about this history is that these people were systems builders. They understood that you needed to work across sectors to bring together production, marketing, distribution, education, and consumption, and work across business, nonprofits, citizens, and governments to collaborate in order to create a successful system. And successful indeed it was, because by the 1920s, we were producing a huge amounts of food in this region and shipping it all across the Midwest. And that system lasted through the World War and into the early 1950s, when everything changed in America and in our region, where a kind of profound consumerism took shape, and the industrial food system began to emerge. The Farm Bill changed from supporting small farmers to supporting corporate systems. And that led to the dismantling of our regional food system, and frankly, virtually all regional food systems across the United States. So that's just a brief snapshot of a kind of history of our regional food system. And I wanted to turn it over to David here for moving forward.
Yeah, and this is actually a really interesting point. You know, the same thing that happened in Duluth happened all throughout the region. I'm going to share my screen with you to show this farm is right below our current farm here in Finland. And, you know, in Finland alone, a small population center, we had 500 acres of cropland and hayland. And people were exporting cream. Each farm had 1 to 6 cows. So this history shows the capacity and the potential of growing our food. And it's kind of interesting, we're wrapping back around the industrialization of agriculture, look at new ways as we cope with new realities. And just
before we move on to the present, we just have a question about one of the phrases on your slide, Randy. Maybe you could quickly clear up the confusion about what do you mean about seeding farms along RR in your table summation?
That was for that the Duluth Commercial Club and this consortium of business people and so forth worked with the railroad to help locate farms along those railroad areas. So they, you know, to essentially facilitate the building of farms in that corridor along the railroads. That's what that meant. Sorry.
Awesome.
So I will continue, and basically just a real quick introduction of myself. You know, I work for Extension now, but we have a farm here in Finland. And, you know, we are trying to figure out how do we move this food system forward. So we have started a CSA here in Finland. We've got land throughout the area that's mostly wild, but we can grow really a lot of food in these what we would call marginal lands. In this case, we have 22 inches of soil on bedrock. So if I were to tell someone that in southern Minnesota, they'd think that was topsoil. So we can grow a lot of food in our marginal lands by really working the land. And we created it through a CSA model, delivered vegetables and farmers market. Some of you locally have been part of this. And so the other thing I did, and I'm going to just carry it through the beginning of this presence section of our webinar, is we looked at research. Could we feed ourselves? When I realized how much food could be produced on our marginal lands, I thought maybe we could feed ourselves. And so we looked at that, and we determined after 8 months of study that we could feed ourselves. We have 1.6 million acres of land that's average or above fertile, and do a local healthy diet. And this would have repercussions economically, annually, almost $1 billion, and also 20,000 new jobs if we were to create a new family farm agricultural systems. We've done research on the Iron Range, similar results, smaller area, to talk about how we can actually do this and what that would mean economically, socially, environmentally. I also work with the university with a citizen-based leadership, and we are working through the university on with communities on problem solving some of these. Our focus areas are 4, but our focus for this presentation is agriculture. And one of the things I saw a question earlier about COVID or some of the challenges right now with the supply chain and all this. We're trying to address some of these issues at farmers markets, at community gardens. How do we bring education to our students? So these are some of the challenges that we're encountering right now. One of the projects that has come to us through this partnership is a seed project. We're looking at a farmer-owned seed co-op. We have farmers engaged in education. How do we create a localization of our seed? So this is underway and happening in our community. Another thing we're doing is a research project, and that's looking at internships on farms. What creates and what kind of experience creates future farmers? And so we're looking at both from interviews from farmers and interns, what is the most effective program on training the next generation of farmers? As you can see in our region, 4 of our counties have had an increase of the number of farmers in the region, which goes against the entire trend in our country of losing farmers on the land. So what's with that? What's going on? Yet 4 of our 5 of the Northeast counties are reducing like the rest of the country. So how do we switch those trends? We're looking at backhaul projects, growing garlic, and using the transportation system that deliveries of foods are dropping the foods off and then bringing product back to redistribute. So looking at garlic research through this program. Working with a Vista person, Sarah Verkey, who's looking at how we can work together, how we can build off each other's strengths to build a food system, because we're not just isolated farms. We're trying to create a system of getting food from these rural and farmers in a way that is efficient, ecological, and nutritive. Also, this new idea of a land trust. How do we get land available to the next generations of farmers? This also addresses wild gatherings. In our region, we have a great ability to gather wild rice, to gather white-tailed deer, to gather fish. And so a new idea, we have to figure out ways and mechanisms to get people access to land because it costs a lot of money to buy. We're working on industrial hemp trials that'll grow in this far north. Incredible product, a credible plant that can be multiple products. Working on root cellar techniques and strategies, because if we can store it, then we can provide year-round produce from the stored foods. But one of the things we have to recognize is the economics of this whole process, the costs to the farmers, the investments, because we're seeing an increase in the number of farm sales, but when you look at the individual farmer income, we're getting a very small portion of that food dollar. Anywhere from 4 to 11 cents of the dollar is going to the farmer. So how do we reorient that food dollar or increase the dollar? Because if you look at the income, look at that left column of 4 negative numbers. That's the median farm income across the United States. The average farm, that was 17, last year was $1,800, the average farm lost. So how are we going to build this system as we're trying to also lift up the farmers, because farmers should not be on food stamps to produce the food for folks. And so to help with income, we're looking at agro-business type efforts. This is a trail, a bike trail connecting farmers to farms to bikers, bikers to farms, to work, to stay, to eat on these farms along the trail. We're looking at ways of providing income, a new project, looking at growing trees for the reforestation, efforts going on with climate change, challenging the canopy of the forests. These students put together, and we found over 36 farms throughout the region, both in the 8 counties, actually 9 counties it bleeded over to, plus Fond du Lac. So these are potential mechanisms, because also I'm trying to figure out how can we support farmers economically so they can stay on the landscape long enough to respond and perhaps eventually get paid to grow the food for a more resilient food system. So there's a lot of things going on currently to look through this. But before we move into the future, Randy might be able to share with you some other ideas.
I just want to say a couple of things, you know, for our future. I think it's clear that the kind of desire and momentum of our region in terms of bringing about a more robust regional food system is here. And how we sort of leverage ourselves and the, you know, our levels of government and the new anchor institutions is really, really key, because as we've tried to kind of sketch out, agriculture is more than food. It's a multifunctional reality that creates impacts and effects throughout all aspects of our rural and urban landscapes. And recognizing that is vital in this sort of emergent era of climate change, where so many things are in flux, and how we become resilient in the face of these climate change challenges has to be a key question that we ask ourselves in every facet of our lives. And in this, I think that, you know, regenerative agriculture can play a phenomenally productive role, given that it is healing in a sense, both socially and ecologically. It has that potential to, you know, increase the health and productivity of both wild and domesticated landscapes. It has the potential to address food insecurity and food sovereignty issues. And I just think that, you know, how we help our leaders in business, industry, and government understand this is really, really key at this moment. And I think what's exciting about the history that I briefly presented to you is that, you know, in this earlier, you know, what you might call food localization 1.0 in the Northeast, that's what they did. They leveraged this cross-sector movement because they understood that to have a permanence in communities meant an agricultural base. And I think that that observation of the early 20th century is perhaps even more crucial in this early 21st century.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because when we were doing the research, Stacy Stark in the GIS lab, she was identifying lands that were suitable for agriculture. And we only chose the lands that were average or above for our study. And what she noticed was the lands that were average or below fertility that were also cleared. A lot of those were the old farming operations. So we need to kind of imagine that social structure, that economic structure of agriculture integrated into all aspects of our lives and our work to feed ourselves. But we also have to do it a little differently in the future because we need to build soil, we need to build capacity. And with that, we can, through those regenerative techniques you're talking about, we can sequester carbon, we can be part of multiple solutions of getting food closer to the people, greens fresher, and because we know how quickly greens nutrient value degrades with time. And give you an example of this, when we got our farm, our land had less than 1% organic matter. And at the time I've done the calculations, it was sequestering 5,800 pounds of carbon on that 1 acre. Now, over 33 years of farming and building the soil and regenerating the soil, we're now over 15% organic matter. And that same acre that was 5,800 pounds of sequestering carbon, now it's 174,000 pounds of sequestered carbon. As we look at using some of the models and building some of that systems that are essential that Randy talks about, we also have to look at that other aspect he mentioned, regenerative, in building our systems more resilient and more sturdy, both socially but ecologically. So there's a lot of hope with that, and there's a lot of promise and opportunity.
And I'm going to share a slide here, David, that is something that I think about in terms of, you know, what are some of the keys that can help achieve the things that David has just kind of talked about? How do we, what are the sort of areas that we can think about in building a place-based agri-food system ecosystem, right? It's because what we're trying to do is really build an ecosystem that enables more and more people to participate. Education is key to this, both formal and informal. I think one of the, crises or tragedies of the closing of the Northeast Agricultural Experimental Station in 1976 for us is that we lost that really important educational infrastructure around agriculture for our region. And this was the only one of the 6 in Minnesota that was closed. The other ones are still going. And, how can we rebuild education around food and agriculture in our region? How do we leverage the institutions? How do we unleash our own impatient creativity? Another area is production skills, right? Farmer to farmer. We have Lake Superior Sustainable Farming Association and many other people like David or the Fisher Merritts and others who have worked in mentoring farmers and led to the creation of more farming. We need to think about processing and distribution, right? How can we capture more of the food dollar beyond simply its seasonal production? How can we process it into other areas, both meat, vegetable, and fruit, and fiber? And community is central to doing this, right? How do we recognize that rural and urban are, part of a seamless whole? And finally, I think entrepreneurship. How do we unleash our impatient creativity to do this? We can't wait. We can't wait for larger institutions to do this. I think we have to do it ourselves through the leveraging of institutions and businesses and so forth around us. And so for me, I think of this as a kind of ecosystem of enabling a regional food system to take shape. And I believe we have the elements of all of this in our region, and it's going to take more connectivity and creativity to grow it, to realize more of the resilient values that David referred to earlier.
And maybe as Federica, this would be a good time to see if there's some questions.
We do have one question, and then I'd love to hear some thoughts about the future and what we can take from the past and present into the future, and maybe thinking about our current pandemic situation and some food rescue needs and how to build resiliency out of this situation. But as that's brewing, Star is wondering if you could say a little bit more about testing the sequestered carbon, David, and how you went about doing that.
Okay, well, basically you can look at the carbon based on percent of organic matter, which is a measurable amount of material in soil. So typically of an organic matter, 58% of that organic matter value is carbon. And so if you take the scientists use 2 million pounds of soil per acre at 6.7 inches soil profile. And you take our acre percent change of organic matter and you can do the calculation. So it's based on a science basis. Different soils would have slightly different numbers, but it actually gives you a mechanism because we have the measurement tool of organic matter. So 58% of organic matter is carbon, and that will help you sequester it looking at the total pounds that are found in that top 6.7 inches of soil. So that's where that calculation comes from.
We've got a few curiosities about current needs for food rescue and building resiliency right now during this pandemic, and using that potentially as a springboard into the kind of food systems that we want to see.
Right. Well, I think, you know, for me, of course, you know, the vulnerabilities and the mortality and morbidity of COVID-19 aligns with people who are more vulnerable in our society. And often that also concerns food insecurity. And, you know, and in many ways, of course, this virus is laying bare the problems of our society and all of the cracks that we've allowed to develop with a world that is predicated on profit and ability to access things if you have enough money. And, you know, I think that one of the frameworks that many people in local foods utilizes is a community food system in which, you know, we understand food as a right and food as something that is, you know, sort of something that we have to figure out how to create greater access to. And you know, how we do that, of course, is very complicated in this system. I know that there are interesting ways in other parts of the country, for example, in New Mexico, where religious organizations are banding together and paying farmers in the last couple months to expand their growing to the extent possible and deliver that produce to food banks and other areas. And that model, I think, is interesting and important. Of course, it does not address the larger structural dimensions of this. And, you know, I think that, again, you know, creating a world in which we expand food skills and food citizenship, which is about both knowledge and access, is absolutely key. And that is going to take shape by strengthening, I think, the connections that we have with each other. And, you know, understanding that we live in a kind of community and regional space in which we all have responsibilities and obligations to one another. And that's why I'm very attracted to the bioregional or regional approach to food systems, where again, we're thinking beyond the individual eater and consumer, and operating at a geographic scale that encompasses a region, and that regional focus, it takes into account not just the human population, but sort of, the natural landscapes and the different sectors and communities within them. And so,
Yeah.
something of a nebulous answer to
Well,
your question.
it's a great backdrop, and it's the underbody of a lot of different changes that need to happen. You mentioned Duluthians spending 60-70% of their income on food, and historically people spent like 40% of their food money on food and 10% on housing. Now it's flipped. Housing's like 40% and people are spending like 10% on their food, and so food has become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper relative to the expenditures, and that's been on the backs of farmers, on the land, on pollution, water pollution, some of these others. I think this time provides us the opportunity. We're seeing online ordering things happening. CSA's demand are picking up. Direct sales mechanisms by farmers. Those are all good and important steps that we need. As we build systems, we need to build consumer farmer cooperatives. So that, remember that food dollar, we're only getting a small percent, trying to increase that percent of that food dollar. And so there's structural ways, there's empowerment ways that we can move it forward. The cool thing is, if we build the food system, it's going to create some jobs and it's going to create some economic vitality in our region in a long, sustained way. And so I think there is, once people understand that, there'll be support by governments, there'll be support by businesses, institutions. And in this time of COVID, it's become very clear this is important. Now, we want to make sure we move into our new system of community-based, community-empowered, community financed and benefits from the work, so that we don't end up, digging down into this corporate model of international food systems. And while we're doing that, figure out the most profitable aspects of our food to localize. And so we can build the mechanisms and the systems and the social structures to start building this, so that as global things start happening, as grocery stores don't have the products, or you're limited with your meat, and there's options for us to make that shift at that time. But we'll have to do it with the low-hanging fruit, build our systems. And so as things change, because we're in a global food market, our prices are somewhat determined, largely determined by the global market. So there's a lot of things. So continuing to build the bricks and mortars and the blocks and the systems and the structures, so that when those moments in history like now happen, we can start to capitalize and move one step forward. Because change needs that to happen in order to take. There's a lot of people working on things, but it takes some other external thing to happen that all of a sudden, whoop, it changed. And so we've seen that in the past, and we'll see that in the future. Other questions?
Kind of in the same vein as what we've been talking about. So we've got geographic changes, but the ways that we organize are really dependent on our government as well. So would either David or Randy or both of you be willing to speak more about ways that you see being the most strategic and successful ways of politically organizing around food, powerful ways of putting pressure on our elected officials to highlight serious importance of regional food systems?
Right. The good news, I think, is that there is a kind of growing understanding and support of organic, regenerative, regional food systems among many of our politicians in our region. And this is a somewhat recent, over the last few years, sort of attention shift. And, I think that the good news is that I think food is you know, can be understood as a nonpartisan issue in many ways, right? It is not oppositional to other activities, and everyone eats. And so I think that under the surface of the partisan noise that we have, regional systems can be something that can track across these partisan divides. And I know that in conversations that I've had with people across the political spectrum, it has that potential. Now, maybe there's differences in how it's approached, of course, but you know, I think that there are building blocks here that that we can move forward. And I think, as David, you said, we're in an inflection point, I think, you know, with coronavirus, where we're not going to go back to normal, whatever that normal was. Things will differ in certain ways. And this did expose some profound vulnerabilities in our supply chains, in our communities. And I think that we have the potential to elevate food systems, you know, as a preventative and preparatory, you know, sector, in addition to sort of the three-legged stool of economics and ecology and social sustainability. And so I think we are on the right track. I think, you know, we have to double down. We have to recognize this inflection point that we're in, and we have to help, you know, make it fertile for our politicians across the spectrum to support a deeper dive into regional food systems.
Great. And I think one thing that would really be great is, since farmers have become such a small percentage of the population, we need all consumers, which we are consumers as well, to start investing in this new system work, investing in the development of co-ops, investing in paying and supporting the building up of the infrastructure. So we're going to need more than just the farmers doing this to be successful. And so I think this will all be something we can all step to the plate for and figure out how to make this table together as we try to build a more constant and penetrating movement into building these systems for a different society that values food, that values quality, that values family and rural living. So I think there's a great opportunity, but we're going to need help by many sectors of our environment, of our social environment, to move forward.
We have a question from Star about information on root cellars and alternatives for those of us with high water tables.
I can say, go to our neighbors with high, yeah, water table, we'd have to go up with that or go out. You know, in Finland, we're looking at 3 different locations for root cellars, that type of approach to build resiliency into root cellars for community good. So I think we need to be doing some community planning to make these spaces most appropriate, most efficient, most economical locations, to start thinking less individually and start thinking a little more collectively to do things we otherwise couldn't. Yeah.
From a question from Facebook, how has COVID-19 affected the Duluth area production and marketing? I know you talked about it a little bit already, so maybe a brief answer for Patrick.
Well, I'll just say, Patrick, that among other things, there's been a real sharp increase in community-supported ag subscriptions and more interest in connecting with farmers directly. Again, I think that this is a sort of a moment that we need to harvest and build upon, because eaters, consumers are thinking more about the quality and availability of food, and so forth. David?
Yeah, I think what I've noticed talking with other farmers around the state, small farms like ours that are more nimble, more flexible, can do direct sales, are gearing up and getting, going. Bigger farms, I know farmers who aren't planting barley because they're not sure they have a market for it. With the big supply chain disruption with the meat market and the meat processing, farmers are selling. There's a farm out west, southwest of one of my colleagues in my work. They're selling all their sows. What that means is a whole generations of pigs aren't going to be put into the market. We're talking 200 sows. We're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of piglets that won't be in the system next year because of the bottleneck that's happening because of the challenges. So I think in some ways, this is hitting the middle-size farms the hardest, and our more smaller, more nimble farms a little less hard, and it's actually an opportunity for us. So I think it depends on who you're talking to on how the response has been and what's looking forward.
I'd like to ask one last question. It's forward focused, it's next generation focused, about education. This is specifically about education with local schools and getting this information and seeding these ideas in our next generation. It's from Jennifer. She's a special education teacher, and she sees that it's a big part, it's a really valuable part for the community. So can we end it out by talking about children in our lives?
Well, I will just say a couple of things. I teach at Lake Superior College. We created this new eco-entrepreneurship program. And in the last month, we have been exploring ways to deepen the connections that we have with schools, both high school and elementary schools, through what's known as Perkins Workforce Development programs. And this is more traditionally an industrial-based program, but it also has this component to agriculture, and again, traditionally more industrial agriculture, but there's a growing recognition that sustainable regenerative agriculture is important. And we are moving towards being able to, in a sense, reclassify this program at Lake Superior College to fit into that funding source, which would then open up resources to work more closely with high schools and schools generally in our region to promote education around agriculture and food, but especially about it as an option for workforce development.
Yeah, and I saw Al Ringer's name was on here earlier. He was part of an initiative that we put together. We trained 13 different farmers, a 10-part curriculum that was done in the 5th grades. And Al Ringer, probably for 5 years, went to 3 or 4 classes in the Two Harbors area every year to all the 5th graders at Two Harbors. I was in Silver Bay, other farmers in other areas, and we were teaching basic things like soil and plants and food. And the funding ran out to keep that going, and it was a great way for farmers to bring their expertise and their experiences and their passion into a curriculum that was very hands-on in the schools. I'd love to see that reinstated so that we have that as a core part of the young educational experience. And integrating it with paying the farmers to do it basically brought a real life, farmer hero right into the classroom that would be able to tell the stories and share their passion. And the year ended with a visit to that farm. So I think really hands-on curriculum, providing income to the farmers to teach these things. Not all farmers want to teach, but plenty do. Reintegrated into the schools will bring another generation. We were able to teach over 8,000 kids in Northeast Minnesota, but it would be great if every kid in Northeast Minnesota had that experience. Food would be looked at very differently.
And I just want to say one last thing here related to this, that Cindy Hale, who is on this call and also works with the Finland Food Chain, she led an initiative when we worked together at the UMD Land Lab that was funded by the Department of Health to build school gardens and some, but most important, to train teachers in managing and integrating curriculum into those gardens. And that provides a platform essentially to train teachers to integrate local food systems, part of, you know, this very important farm to school programming that we need to broaden, not just in the realm of education, or in delivering farm produce to schools and making that more open to be able to provide that as an opportunity for expanding farmers' revenue, but also providing the amazing benefits to young people of locally harvested produce. And so, you know, ending farm to school is going to be key to this in all of its facets.
Yeah, and there's a great local champion here, Tom Frericks, has put together an incredible farm to school project here in Silver Bay. Literally, if you kick a field goal far enough, the ball will bounce into the orchard. It's pretty awesome, and integrating it into the schools is kind of what we need to have become the norm.
Thank you so much for your questions, and thank you, David and Randy, for sharing your insights and experience.
Great. Take care, everyone.
Have a great rest of your day.